Well, good evening, and thank you for coming on what's not a particularly nice night to the second in this series of 5 talks. Here's the overall title up here for the series. Those of you who were brave enough to come to the first one, remember the zoo was actually closed on that night, so we're doing a little better tonight, and it all had to take place in the foyer of the zoo. Okay, well, I'm Andy Whiten, and I'm the director of the Living Links to Human Evolution Research Centre, Living Links for short, which is up the hill, which I hope all of you know. If you haven't been there, you're very welcome to visit. And for me, because of that, it's a very nice sort of sense of deja vu to be in this little lecture theatre, because 3 years ago I was in here. Someone not going to bed quite yet, we can hear. 3 years ago, I was here listening to someone standing here, Jane Goodall, who was here giving a little talk as part of her opening Living Links, which was a great honour. So that's nice to look back on that. Here I am, standing in the same spot as Jane Goodall. And in that same year, of course, Princess Anne was here opening Budongo itself. So it was another event to remember. Well, I'm going to start off using my place in all of this by giving you an overview of this series of 5 talks. And we've started off here with the blinds up. When Jane Goodall and Princess Anne were here, the blind was down, they gave the talk, and this was during the day, and then the blind went up, the projection screen went up, and there were the chimpanzees, and because it was the day, I think Ricky it was who was standing there when Princess Anne did her stuff, and so she was able to go on and have a little conversation with Ricky, and I think Jane Goodall obviously appreciated communicating with the chimpanzees. Tonight, of course, I think they're all pretty much asleep. I think you saw 1 or 2 just, rear their heads a little bit. But because they're asleep, I think I'm going to put the screen down now, which is probably all we're going to see, and then I can use the screen to tell you what I want to tell you. So let's put that down. And what you're going to see is the title of my talk tonight. As I say, I'm going to start off just by giving you an overview of what this whole series is about. And what it relates to is the fact that in Living Links, and I should just add to that, Budongo has now become part of a kind of research consortium with Living Links, so it is totally appropriate to be giving the talk in here tonight as well. And it's because of this series of talks being organised by Living Links that I'm introducing myself tonight. For the other ones, I'll be introducing the speakers. I've already introduced the first one, Mike Huffman. So here's the series of talks, which I guess you know. You've all seen the posters, and you've come along, perhaps coming along to more than one of them. In the first one, Michael Huffman talked quite a lot about chimpanzees, but also several other animals. And what he was doing was kicking off this whole idea, which runs as a kind of theme through this series, which really underlies all the work we do in Living Links, that we are primates. All these other primates that we study are part of our primate family. And for a lot of biomedical research, this evolution principle is really important. It underlies a lot of what goes on. And this year, our efforts at engaging the public and audiences like this, giving public lectures, is supported by the Wellcome Trust, which is really the UK's largest medical charity, supporting a lot of research. And because of the nature of the Wellcome Trust, we have a kind of theme running through a lot of our efforts this year, which has to do with the title. The title of our grant is Living Links to Human Biology and Medicine, and as you can see here, we're talking about living links more broadly to human health, mind, which comes into what I'm going to talk about tonight, and medicine. So Mike Huffman kicked us off by talking about what we regard as natural medicines in non-human primates and indeed in other animals as well. And some of those are things that are ingested, and others are things that are applied externally. So this is just a reminder for those of you who were there what he was talking about. Here's an example of chimpanzees. I'll actually come back and talk about some cultural aspects of this later on. But the chimpanzee is ingesting a leaf which, instead of actually biting it and chewing it up, it ingests whole. And what Mike Huffman discovered was that these leaves pass right through the chimpanzee, and they're very rough. They're actually taking in leaves that don't look very appetizing. They have a very rough surface. They fold them up in the mouth, and then they go through the gut. And when you find them coming out whole, often they have actual gut parasites stuck to them. It's almost as if you've eaten a kind of Brillo pan that's gone through and scoured out your gut and taken some of the parasites there. And they do that more when they've got parasite infestations. So that's just one example from chimpanzees, and I can't resist mentioning that there's another great example when we look at externally applied medicines, which you can see if you go to living links, because our capuchin monkeys in the wild rub themselves with all kinds of smelly things, sometimes actual insects like ants, and they make a certain smell, and that seems to act as a kind of insecticide in the wild. And what we found is we can elicit that behaviour rather well by actually giving them smelly foods like leeks or onions. And instead of eating those, they'll start rubbing them on each other. So I don't know if you've seen that. You'll see it actually done a few times a week at Living Links. If you don't see it, there's a videotape there showing you what goes on. And they get very excited about it, actually. It seems to be kind of like a contagious behaviour. Some of them get together and they do all this rubbing and rub their backs on and get the stuff all over them. So that's what Mike Huffman was focusing on. I'm giving a talk which links with that today in ways you'll see, but I'm, as I say, really the one that brings in the mind aspect of this broad title, and we're doing that really because, more broadly, that's the kind of research we do at Living Links and to some extent in Wodongo, but I am bringing in these little topics as well, as you'll see. Then next week, we have Professor Gillian Bentley coming up from Durham University, and we're very fortunate to be having her to come and speak to us on this topic, the emerging field of evolutionary medicine. This is the basic idea that a lot of medicine doesn't really take much account of the fact that we are products of evolution, and so a lot of the pathogens and problems that cause diseases with us, but also our responses to those have also got an evolutionary history, which people like Gillian Bentley are saying we should take more account of. Just to give you one example of that, we tend to think of a fever as a kind of symptom, a problem that we need to deal with, often by cool them down, that they've got a fever. And the evolutionary medicine people are saying, well, hang on, why are we doing that? Why are we like that? And showing that to some extent that high temperature actually kills off bugs, and therefore it's more important maybe to manage that rather than just see it as a sort of problem symptom. That's just one little example. And this field has been going for a while, and it's also called not evolutionary medicine, but as you might expect, Darwinian medicine. Here's one of the first books on this, Why We Get Sick, which goes right back to the 90s, and it's had a slow burn, this whole field, but now it's becoming more established, and this second publication I've just thrown up here is a kind of underlining that, because this is the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA, a very prestigious journal. If something happens in here, you can tell now it's really arrived. And here was a whole issue of this journal with the title Evolution in Health and Medicine, edited, among others, by this man here, Randolph Nest, who was one of the originators of the field. Well, he's in the USA, as was George Williams, who sadly passed away. But I asked Randolph Ness, well, we want to put on this series of talks, we ought to have someone right in the centre of it talking about evolutionary or Darwinian medicine. Who should we get? He said, Gillian Bentley, if you can get her. So we've got her, and she's coming next week, and we've passed our poster and all the adverts around the medical fraternity as well. We hope some of them might come along and be interested in that. And then the fourth talk is by Catherine Adamson, who I know is with us tonight, somewhere in the audience there, taking this in. Colleague of mine from the University of St Andrews, who's an expert in virology, and also, we're very pleased to know, very interested in zoos and selling our science to the public at large, which is something that we're very keen on, but she's actually done in the USA, working in the National Zoo, as I recall, in Washington. And this story, again, underlines a theme that comes through a lot of these talks of the continuity between ourselves and other animals, particularly our closest relatives, non-human primates, And this isn't one of Catherine's pictures, it's from somewhere else, a kind of popular way of trying to get over the idea that we've now got HIV, AIDS, as something that's passed along from non-human primates, the chimpanzee. And curious thing, there's lots of simian immunodeficiency viruses around in Africa, and 2 of them seem to have somehow merged in some way, or the genomes of those have merged in what's gone into chimpanzees. That's by chimpanzees eating these, people have eaten chimpanzees, and so it's passed along. So again, that very much underlines this story of the continuity between ourselves and other species, and the way in which, in this case, diseases can really hop from species to species that are very closely related to them. But discovering all that and working out the details of that is absolutely fascinating detective story, a scientific detective story, and I think that's what Catherine is going to be talking about. There's other examples that I think she may allude to, which have come up since, and this is a rather similar story in malaria, for example. And then the final talk is by another of my colleagues in my department, actually, Professor David Perrick, a very eminent psychologist, who's been famous for a number of years by studying our perception of faces. And one aspect of that he's looked at is the perception of beauty. And here was a cover from the prestigious journal Nature, in which he had an article about what's going on there, and the perception of beauty according to things like symmetry and even averageness and averaging across individuals, produced by this kind of cumulative image produced here. But more recently, he's got interested in the links between this and health. So here's a series of pairs of photographs of the kind he presents to people, asking them such questions as, well, which one of those is more attractive? You know, if you're thinking of someone who might be a mate for you, you know, which one of the pair would you be picking? And there we're talking about certainly perception of health and perhaps of beauty. The 2 things maybe go together at this level. But that's the kind of thing that David Perrick's going to be talking about, and he's got some fascinating research to tell you about. So that's the set of the 5 talks, and as you can see, some of them refer quite a lot to animals, to primates, others more specifically to humans. And it's quite interesting that this general field of Darwinian and evolutionary medicine itself, although it's got obviously a central thread to do with evolution, doesn't necessarily refer back to animals and even primates, whereas some of our talks obviously do. And by putting them in this series, we're hoping to see some of the potential links between them. Ideally, we'd have all the 5 speakers in the same sort of series in one day, but that doesn't really work out in the way we like to present these talks to you. So we have this series of 5. Well, here's mine: culturally transmitted information, nutrition and health being the main ways in which I'm going to fit into this thread. But I'm also going to talk to you a lot about our specific research on the cultural behaviour of chimpanzees, and there are these links, we think, between ourselves and other primates. And I can start to introduce the idea that lies behind this by showing you this mural, which we recently put up in Living Links. So if you go out onto the main balcony at Living Links, which some of you will know, now, as you turn around and look back at the building, you will see this in a big sort of explanation board at the back. And what you have here is a kind of evolutionary tree of the primates. I mean, it's somewhat metaphorical, obviously. It's not accurate in all the relationships between it, but what it's meant to convey is that all the primates had a common ancestor about 65 million years ago. So you can imagine that kind of right down at the base of the trunk, in fact, way down here in the roots, really, because already by this point here, which is about 35 million years ago, there was a branch leading off to the New World, to South and Central America, and the examples of those we have in the zoo include our living lynx monkeys, the capuchin monkey there at the bottom, and the squirrel monkey. And then the next major branch off is between the old world monkeys and the apes, which is the rest that goes off here. So we're now in the old world of Africa and Asia, and we have a gelada there, a macaque, and a Diana monkey. And then we go off to the apes, where there was a branching about 14 million years or so, leading to the Asian great apes, the orangutan. A little before this was the gibbons, I should add, but you know, they're not shown in the tree. I mean, obviously we've only got 8 primates here and there are hundreds. So these are some representatives. And then behind the human is a branch off to the gorillas, and then the final branching here leads to ourselves, humans, and chimpanzees with a split about 7 million years ago. The human in the picture, I'm pleased to say, we were very honoured to have this mural inaugurated by Professor Anne Glover, who is the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Scottish Government. She's the Chief Scientific Advisor in Scotland, and we were very pleased that she was very easy to persuade to come and inaugurate this in this way and give her kind of seal of approval to what we're trying to do. Not only the primate research we're trying to do here, but the ways in which we're trying to communicate some of the main themes to the visiting public at large. Okay, well, so there's a very sort of pretty version of what lies behind my story. Here's a more kind of technical illustration, which is just the same thing. You'll see some of the same dates here, and up here are the apes, including the lesser apes, down here the old world monkeys. So let's just focus in on the apes, the great apes, in fact. Blow that up so you can see it well, and add some pictures. Faces you all know very well. There they all are, our closest family, the great apes. And the point I want to make at the beginning of this is that all of these animals share a lot of sort of fundamental characteristics with ourselves. It's very obvious we're a great ape, they're a great ape, because of the form of our body, this kind of flattening, the way we're built, very different to a monkey who's more dog-like in its structure. We don't have tails, we have very big brains for our body size, and so on and so forth. We share certain characteristics, so it's reasonably easy, actually, to reconstruct what our common ancestor of 6 million years ago with chimpanzees would have looked like, sharing these characteristics, and indeed the ancestor of all the great apes, the kind of average great ape. And we're able to do that by looking at all the characteristics that are shared across a group and then assigning them or attributing them to our common ancestor. And on a larger scale, it would be the same way as where we look at all the birds. They've all got feathers, and we therefore believe that the common ancestor of all these birds would be feathered at some stage, and the rest have got feathers now because they're all descended from this common root. And what psychologists, evolutionary comparative psychologists like me are doing, is taking the same approach to aspects of the way the mind works and behavioural patterns. In this case, what I'm going to talk about is culture. So I'm taking the same approach to say, well, what do we share with some of these other apes, or what do they share with us, which allows us then to understand what our common ancestors would have behaved like. And I'm focusing on culture, and therefore we have to ask questions, well, a bit like this, you know, for all these species we have to know, well, what cultural-like things are they doing? But this kind of question, well, do chimpanzees have culture? And you ask it of any species, you know, do crocodiles have culture? Do fish? As if there's going to be a yes or no answer is really far too simple for any sort of interesting scientific approach to this topic. So we really want to set that aside, and what I've done is to break culture down into a number of particular characteristics that we can look at in rather more detail. And there are three broad ones that I've looked at. The first of all has to do with what I call population level patterning. And what I'm talking about here is behaviour that we would describe as a tradition, because it's a behaviour pattern that is passed on from individual to individual by some kind of learning that we would call social learning, such as observing others, learning from what they do, and then that behaviour spreads across a whole community and becomes tradition. And in the first level of analysis here, what I'm doing is saying, well, how is that all distributed, or those traditions distributed in time and space? And we can compare different species in that way, and that's really what I'm going to focus on. First of all, let's just go back a second. The second category here, cultural contents, refers to the actual behavioural contents of the culture. So in the case of human cultures, that involves things like ceremonies and religions that we're probably not going to see in chimpanzees. But other aspects of behaviour, such as the use of tools, if that's cultural, well, that would be a content of these cultures which we can compare between chimpanzees and ourselves. Whereas if we're looking at, say, some of those population level patternings of traditions, we might see a similar kind of patterning in such species as, well, let's say dolphins. But the actual contents of their behaviour that made them cultural would be clearly rather different. And then the final category is what I call transmission mechanisms, and that's processes that actually allow the social learning to go on. things like imitation or teaching. And it could be that some of these things are similar across certain species, and yet the way in which they're transmitted is different. It gets a bit more complicated. You can split those into various subcategories. Basically what I'm doing is saying, well, what do humans do in those subcategories, just represented here kind of abstractly in terms of these funny shapes, and then say, well, if we look at another species like chimpanzees, do we see some of those that are similar? And we'll probably like to define, well, some things are similar, some things are not, some things are absent that humans do. But the ones that are present, we then attribute to this common ancestor. And we can do the same thing for more distantly related animals like other great apes. In this case, the orangutan, that's the same kind of question. Find similarities. We're probably not going to find so many similarities, but the ones that we do find, then these broader things that are shared, we can then attribute to a common ancestry. So I'm going to start off by talking about a couple of our major discoveries, I would say, at the level of the population patterning. This goes back now over 10 years to a study which was the first one to really try and pull together all we knew at this stage on the basis of the long-term studies of chimpanzees right across Africa. And these people here, my co-authors, were each the leaders of a whole research group that have been studying chimpanzees at one particular place for 10, 20 or sometimes 30 years. In fact, a total of 150 years of observation could now go into this analysis already then. We know much more now. And what we did was what we called a two-phase study. We first of all asked each of these research leaders, well, what do you suspect might be cultural variations or traditions? Things that you've seen a lot at your side, and yet you've heard actually don't happen somewhere else. Or the other way around, things that are very common somewhere else, and yet, 20 or 30 years you've never seen them at your site. And that was our starting point, and that established a kind of list of candidate cultural variants, of which there were 65. And then we gave that list back, very carefully defined, in a big table to say, okay, now, for each of those at your site, tell us whether they are very common, what we call customary, pretty much done by everybody, or at least habitual, so that there's a lot of individuals doing them multiple times, kind of circumstantial evidence for it being some kind of socially learned behaviour that's spread to be perhaps a subculture, you might say, or at the other extreme, of course, absent, which is the really interesting case, although there, of course, we want to distinguish between whether there's some obvious environmental explanation for that or not. So if we're looking at something like nut cracking with rocks, which happens in certain parts of Africa, we find, well, it doesn't happen over there. Well, in fact, there aren't the nuts there. That's not very interesting. But if all the raw materials are there, and yet it's not happening, as is the case for this nut cracking. In fact, it happens across one area of West Africa, and on the other side of a large river, people have gone to check. It's the same nuts, all these raw materials are there, but they just haven't got it. Then the circumstantial evidence suggesting this is cultural variation. And on that basis, we identified at that stage 39 cultural variants, as we call them, or traditions. And each of these panels represents the same 39 possibilities, but as you can guess, they're lit up with squares if they're customary, or the circles if they're habitual, really very common, as opposed to the dull circles, which mean never absent there. At some places, these little no entry signs mean, as I indicated a moment ago, well, there aren't the raw materials, or there's some other reason to think, well, they wouldn't happen anyway, couldn't happen anyway. So the interesting contrasts are where there are dull circles somewhere, and yet they're lit up somewhere else. Well, these include a whole range of behaviours. You can't probably read them very well at all. And I don't have time to go through them. There's one of them blown up for the Thai forest, so you can just read some of them and get some idea of the kind of behaviours that we might be referring to. For the moment, all I'll say is they do range across a whole variety of chimpanzee behaviours, complicated ways of processing foods, various kinds of tool use, lots of different kinds of tool use, in fact, but also social behaviour, grooming techniques, the way they groom each other, and courtship gambits. Just to give you one little example here, I've got index hit. That's when you've groomed an ectoparasite off somebody else. What do you do with it? How do you dispatch it? Well, if you're in the Thai forest, you put it on your hand and you just squash it with your finger. But if you're over in East Africa, you pick some leaves first, and you put this thing on some leaves and you'll squash it in leaves. So that's just one. It's quite a subtle little difference, but so a lot of the cultural differences amongst humans, and that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Well, that was just over 10 years ago, and since then many more cases have been piling up. And I'm just going to illustrate one of those that I think is perhaps one of the most complicated and I think fascinating for additional reasons. And this is one described by Cricket Sands and her colleagues, where chimpanzees, you'll see in the video clip I'm now going to show you, they come into the centre of a clearing, and they've already brought the second tool that they're going to use, they thought that far ahead, in their mouths. They've sometimes got several of them. They've brought them some distance. They're fresh. Now, when they get there, however, they pick up one of the big thick sticks you see it using there that they've left at the side, and they make a tunnel down to the subterranean termites, which they're going to get, which chimpanzees across the rest of Africa don't really take. You'll see chimpanzees, you've probably seen them on the TV, using little stems and sticks to go into termite mounds. That's quite common. But here you've got something more elaborate. So, but I can't get the video to play in this. So, I'm going to play it here. Here we go. So here's one chimpanzee already coming on the scene. As you can see, it's got these second tools it's going to use already in its mouth, some of these fresh stems. And you're going to see several chimpanzees come on the scene. They get quite excited. You'll see some greeting behaviour as they come and join each other at this exciting place. Here's another one coming with its tools ready. And I think this is the one you're going to see actually do the stuff. Now it's picking up the thick stick. Okay, the board stick, it's going to clean it off, make a little indentation where it's going to put this thing down. And it's going to put nearly all of that stick right down deep. And it's so tough to do. You can say, I often say at this point, it's like Mr. McGregor digging his garden, you know, it's like what you do with a spade. And here's, you can hear the excited noise. I guess the other people on the other side of the screen may be waking up now thinking, what's going on in that room? It takes quite a while pushing this thick stick down. When it's done that, then it's made this tunnel. Then it's going to use the second tool that's in its mouth, and it's going to fashion that though. It's going to modify that before it uses it. You won't be able to see that quite so well. It's difficult to get an image that shows everything. But you will be able to see that it strips it through its mouth and makes a brush tip on this end. Here you are. Okay, it's already stripping bits away. And the animal to its left has already been a bit smarter. I mean, I think it's probably going to use its tunnel to get the first termites out. But you'll see this stripping, and just the edge of it. Now the right side, can you see that little bit sticking out? You see that's going all frayed. That's what I'm talking about, and that's a really good tool to get termites out. Of course, tricky to get down the tunnel, but that's what it's going to do now. Put it right down, and that's a good thing to get the termites to bite on, and then it'll pull it out. And what's interesting about this is that, well, it was discovered actually through having hidden cameras. So normally it can take 5–10 years to find this kind of thing in chimpanzees, because you've got to habituate and get close to them and so on. But here they had these action-operated hidden cameras, and so they got this quite early on. Very exciting material. And it's been suggested that, well, perhaps this has a characteristic which otherwise... okay, let me get out of that. Back to my slide here. Perhaps this is showing something that otherwise we would say is really a characteristic of that distinguishes human culture from all the rest, and that's what's called cumulative culture. The fact that our cultures build sometimes generation by generation. Certainly they have been doing recently with it. This kind of process has gone very fast. In olden days it happened much slower, but certainly cumulative progress builds on the shoulders of what went before. And here's our best kind of story of this, because most of the stories we've got of this are just a few thousand years old. This is the 2.6 million year story of the cumulative cultural evolution of the hammer stroke axe, from just rocks to begin with, and then some hafting, and then ultimately the kind of sophisticated modern hammers, and even a Victorian steam hammer here. Well, this of course isn't anything as elaborate as that, but it does seem to be building on simple behaviours. That's what you see in most parts of Africa, and having elaborated it. So although we don't know the particular history of that, it's a reasonable guess that this must have been elaborated over some time to take on this complicated picture like this of multiple tools, and particularly the stripping of this tool. Most chimpanzees, when they're using the little stems or whatever to fish with, when it gets frayed, they seem to think that's not right and bite the end off and sharpen it and then use that, whereas here they're carefully fraying it so that it works, even though that's a bit tricky to do, putting it down such a long tunnel. Okay, well, so let's go back now to some of the examples which have been long established and from our first study, because a couple of these I'm going to relate to my theme at last, talking about health and nutrition in this case. The first one is the very first on the list, and we're at Bossou now in West Africa, which is the only place you see this. And here, this thing is showing a little palm tree here with things striking it at the top, because chimpanzees actually climb up into a palm tree where they've left, or other chimpanzees have often left a frond of the palm. And what they do is take what they can from the growing point of the palm tree. That's what they're after. It's very nutritious. But once they've got the first bit out, then they use this frond as a tool to beat down into that. And that's why it's called pestle pounding, because it looks like an African woman doing these huge pestle operations, as you'll see in the video clip I'm going to show you. And then that makes a kind of soup or mush that the chimpanzee can scoop out with its hands, and then it'll do it again. It's an extraordinary behaviour, I think, and now you're going to see it. It has a little cartoon at the top of what it looks like. Here's the chimpanzee actually doing it. You're going to see it better in close up now. Okay, so extraordinary behaviour. Standing bipedally and very forcefully, and actually, if you can see what's going on, very accurately using that to get more food out of the top of this palm tree. Now, as I say, that only happens in Bossou, here, and it doesn't even happen in the Thai forest, which is only a few hundred kilometres away, and where there's the same palm tree, same subspecies of chimpanzee, and that's some of the reasons why we think it's cultural. Now, both these places, however, there's another behaviour happens, but again doesn't happen in East Africa, despite there being the raw materials there, and that's this behaviour of nut cracking. The first little clip you're going to see here is just using a wooden tool. Actually, this isn't from Bossou, this is from the Thai forest, and so this behaviour happens across an area like this. But doesn't, I think it's this river here, it doesn't happen on the other side of the river. And in the next slide you'll see some other instances of this, which illustrate, I think, why it can take many years, sometimes as long as 8 or 9 or 10 years, for chimpanzees to grow and perfect doing this. Because you might think it's easy, you get your big rock and you whack the nut, but in fact if you do that you just smash it all and there'll be nothing left to eat. So it's actually quite skilled to get it right. And here's a couple of instances of why that's sometimes the case. Here, a chimpanzee having gone up onto a little log and so on. That's quite tricky. And here you can see this is probably going to be a bad idea, that what's going to happen here. Yeah, okay, so quite tricky. And here a stone hammer being used, which is used at both these sides. At the Bossou one, that's all they use because they don't really have so much of the wooden raw materials. But at Thai, they discriminate. They use this for the very hard nuts. They use wooden hammers more leisurely, in a more leisurely way, in a sense, across the other nuts. Now, what's interesting here in Bossou is that, like many chimpanzees, they're facing a seasonal environment where there's a season of the year, typically one season, where life gets very tough. It's a dry season, and apes really like to eat fruits. That's really their kind of natural and favourite food. That's what chimpanzees need to be really healthy. And so when they hit this period, it's like a kind of feeding bottleneck. It's a nutritional bottleneck. How do they get through it? The answer is they get through it by their material technology, by using these two different kinds of tools, the pestle pounding to get the stuff out of the top of the palm trees, the nut cracking to get nuts. And these then, in that bottleneck season, provide a very significant proportion of their dietary intake. So they're able to remain healthy and well fed, is my point here, because of this. And it's Gen Yamakoshi who really established that, all the Japanese who work at what is a Japanese research site, Bossou. And in this chapter I've written about this and several other aspects of what have I called it here, nutrition and health in the great ape clade, my theme today. And I'm going to talk about a couple of more of these in a moment. Okay. So what am I going to say next? Back to the slide there. Yes, okay. Right, so what's our evidence for saying that these are cultural behaviours? Well, I haven't really explained that fully yet. I've sort of given an idea, and we can talk about it for the pestle pounding. It's happening here, it's not happening here, and really by a process of exclusion, we're saying, but it's the same species of palm trees, it's the same subspecies of chimpanzees, and just by a process of exclusion, we can't really see any genetic or environmental reasons why there's this difference. And we couple that with observations that show young chimpanzees very carefully actually watching what the elder ones doing, whether it's nut cracking or pestle pounding, or in this case, termite fishing. So that long ago when Jane Goodall presented this picture, she actually already called it socially learning. Here's this young Fifi watching her mother flow, doing the termite fishing. We couple that with the kind of evidence I've been talking about. That's how we reach this conclusion. But it's not a completely watertight conclusion. Can we be sure these are really socially learned traditions? Maybe, if we come back to that pestle panning, there's some subtle difference in the palm trees at these places that we just haven't picked up. You know, can we be sure? Maybe Fifi here is actually just scrounging and scavenging. What she's interested in, can I get a termite while her mother's not watching? And then maybe because she's a clever animal, later on she'll work out how to do this. What you'd really like scientifically to clinch this is an experiment. But there are very careful observations, I think, that give us more confidence, even before you do the experiments, that there is something cultural going on here. And I want just to pick up on a study by Elizabeth Lonsdorf, which had to do with sex differences in the learning of young chimpanzees. And this was about the termite fishing. We just had another image of there. And what Elizabeth did was very carefully watch a number of young infants and what they did in the course of learning to termite fish. And what she found was that there was quite a big difference, actually, between the little girl chimpanzees and the little boy chimpanzees. Females were much more conscientious of watching their mother, very carefully watched what she did, and were much more intent on that. The males were not so. They were often, you know, play fighting in the bushes, and you know, those of you who've got children or know primary school teachers may sort of think of maybe echoes of something a bit familiar to us there, attention deficit or something. The males, well, no, they had other things to do. And that seemed to have really serious effects, because when she plotted out how early they managed to actually manage to termite fish, she found that the little female chimpanzees were managing it much earlier. They were perfecting it much earlier, well over a year ahead. And here's, for those of you who like graphs, the black dots are the females and the white squares are the males, and here's their age in years. So if we just think in terms of, well, when have 3/4 of them mastered it? For the females, it's up here, it's probably just less than 4. And for males, where are we? Way over here. You know, something like 7 or something, 6 or 7. So a significant difference. Well, one reason that may link, oh yes, another little bit of even more tantalizing evidence that mothers vary in their actual technique, how deeply they put their termite fishing tool in. And what you find is that if you know that, you can predict significantly how deep their daughters are going to do it as well. So that's a correlation. Here's a correlation graph basically expressing that for daughters. But for sons you don't get that effect. You can't predict what boys are going to do on the basis of what their mothers do. So it looks as if females are not only learning a lot from their mothers, they're actually perhaps learning even something about the particular technique. They're watching more carefully and learning more. Okay, well, one reason that then relates to our overall topic about nutrition and health and so on is that Bill McGrew, a number of years ago, in this paper, quite a long time ago now, suggested there might be an explanation for the broader sex difference we found in chimpanzees, that males spend some time hunting large vertebrate prey. By large vertebrate prey, I mean monkeys are often their favourite prey. And they'll go up in the tops of the trees, often as a group together, and together they'll catch monkeys, and given they catch them, they mostly eat them. They'll share little bits, and everyone's there begging to get little bits, and some of the females do, their favourite females get more, their male allies get more, but broadly they eat most of it. So females don't get so much vertebrate meat, but protein's important to these animals, and what McGrew pointed out was that in fact there's data that even adults take more, female adults take more insect prey. They spend more time in this technology getting insects, not only termites, but ants and others out. And so maybe that's important to adults. So it would make sense, therefore, that the young females spend more time really attending to this, because this is really going to be important in their adult foraging ecology, more than for males. Okay. Well, but then another approach to really pinning down what's cultural would be to do experiments. I mean, for scientists, it's often thought to be, you know, the gold standard of scientific method to really establish cause and effect is to do an experiment. And here, the kind of experiment you might do, if you were interested in, say, pestle pounding, would be to take a chimpanzee from Bosu and, as it were, parachute it into Thai forest. Well, not literally parachute it, but somehow take it there and see, well, if you introduce it into a community, does the behaviour spread? that would, and if it did, well, you know, no one would really question that. Okay, you've shown that this is cultural. Well, there are practical and logistic and really kind of ethical reasons why that's not happened. You can probably imagine, in fact, taking a chimpanzee, particularly male chimpanzee, into another community, it would probably get killed. So, hasn't happened yet, although there are some other primates where it's more feasible. In fact, we've just started doing these kind of experiments in South Africa with some species of monkeys. That's another story. What I want to tell you about now, keeping on the chimpanzee theme, is experiments that we've done with captive chimpanzees, which I think are very interesting. The first experiment's done to actually try and tease out the transmission of culture. This is our first attempt, where we take two groups of chimpanzees, that's the circles here, who can't see each other. We present them with exactly the same problem, the same task, which is one we call the panpipes, because there are two pipes here, one on top of the other, and there's a grape stuck behind a blockage up here, outside their cage. Well, what we do is we take just one chimpanzee out for a little while, and we show it that what you can do with your stick tool that you've got is poke it through the bars, and you can lift the blockage up out of the way, and then of course the grape will roll down. It's not something chimpanzees normally do, and when we just give chimpanzees the task there, none of them actually worked out, clever as they are, how to do that. But we can show one chimpanzee, train it how to do that. And then we take exactly the same problem, and here it is over here, and there's a little flap you can see in the front of the panpipes here. We take one chimpanzee out of here, and we show it there's a very different way to do it. You can poke your stick in here and push the blockage back, so you knock the grape off the back, and then it rolls forward, and again, you get the grape, but using a very different technique. And so we've now got one expert who knows each of these techniques. We introduce it back into the rest of the group. These chimpanzees aren't called Amy Whiten, it's my daughter who very nicely drew them. And so it's open to them, you know, who watches and who learns, if any. And our question is going to be, of course, well, do those two different behaviours spread to become two different traditions in the group? And I'm not going to show you exactly the results of this now, just tell you, well, it did. But I'll show you the results for that later, because having introduced the idea, I'll just show you one rather more complicated version of this experiment, where we have three groups down here who can all see their neighbours, and then we have another three groups here who can all see their neighbours, but they can't see the other triplet of groups. And you can probably see some big windows down here at the bottom. That's where they can watch their neighbours. And again, we take just one chimpanzee here, and we show it one way to solve this task. Again, kind of very naturalistic task in which you can open up a hatch here, push your stick down, stab these dates or grapes and pull them out. But over here, we show, again, just one chimpanzee, how to get them out a different way by raising this hatch here, using a different kind of tool to push the things out of this tunnel. So we start off here with one chimpanzee knowing how to do it, introduce it to the rest of the group. And what we say is, as soon as half the group master getting the food out, then we move it here, so these guys can watch what those ones are doing, and then after a few hours we move it here and give them a go. Same thing if half of them do, we move it here so they can watch, and finally we move it here and say, okay, what do they do? Do they do anything like how it started out over here? And of course we're doing the same thing over here, but having introduced a very different technique. So it's a very powerful scientific method to actually experimentally get at the transmission of traditions, you know, whether chimpanzees can sustain traditions, indeed well enough to actually pass from group to group. Because if we're right about what's happening in something like, say, stone tool use spreading across West Africa, well, that's what has to happen. It has to go from community to community to community in some reasonably high fidelity way. Well, here we've got a graph I'm going to show you with the colour-coded. That's one way of doing it, that's another way of doing it. That model wasn't so active as this one, but that's the first 100 things they do. So here's the first 100 things they did. They did it 50 times before we let others watch. So let's run that little graph, and as you can see, each one of those bars is a chimpanzee, in the order in which it spread, and it did spread. This one spread in this group, this one spread in this group, but wait a minute. There's one chimpanzee clever enough, or if you like, non-conformist enough, to watch what the other ones did, and then work out for itself that, could do it, I'm going to try doing this, and oh, sure, I can get it out the other way. In other words, invented the technique of the other group. And you might think because of that is actually this method, if you know anything about chimpanzees, they very much enjoy sticking sticks in things, the stabbing, as it were, behaviour might be a sort of rather chimpy, latent behaviour, that would spread. And so we'd end up with the graph all dark because they're all doing the same thing by the end. But in fact, that wasn't the case at all. To the contrary, the difference is maintained. I mean, this one in particular isn't even doing that behaviour at all. They're doing just what was seeded at the beginning and what most chimpanzees did most of the time. So that's a pretty impressive demonstration. It gets better. I don't have much time to go through the details of this, but those are the same data expressed in a different way. Each block here is a chimpanzee, and you can see the colour coding. That's what those did and what those did. And because of that, we're calling these two different cultures. Here's the task. I'm not even going to go into the details of that. What I want to point out is that when we did this in another location, the Yerkes Centre in Africa, in Atlanta, we got exactly the same kind of patterns, all these differences on different kind of tasks. Here's the panpipes that I did introduce earlier on, with poking being introduced in one group and everybody doing that, really. Lifting being introduced in this group, and most of them doing lifting. So certainly a different tradition here, although some corruptions to doing the poking behaviour. But we're calling these cultures now because we're defining cultures now as made up of multiple traditions. And what's nice about these results is that they converge, we think, with our interpretations of what's happening in the wild. These multiple tradition cultures is what we're inferring. Well, here we're producing those experimentally in ways which mean that these are definitely socially learned. Here we might still question it, but here we're showing that chimpanzees have this capacity to pass on traditions. Well, there's a story here for these chimpanzees behind here, a project that's been done this summer by Pete Buchanan, who's a master student of mine, who's here this evening. And he did this with the same panpipes again, and some of you will know these names of the chimpanzees here. And what this rather complicated story is here is that it's a quantitative numerical analysis which basically puts together, very close together, those individuals who hang out a lot together. So these are two ones who are, you know, buddies. These two would be found a lot together. And as you go out further and further into these hierarchical structures here, you're identifying what's basically a subgroup on one side and another subgroup on the other side, which are put in capitals there. And the reason for that is, again, as some of you may know and guess, these are the original Edinburgh chimpanzees. The ones at the bottom are the ones who came in from Holland just over a year ago. I think I suppose it was about a year and a half ago now. And they've sure mingled and so on. They get on okay together, don't seem to have any great problems. But you can actually tell by looking at exactly who does hang out with whom that there are, in fact, there is in fact significant subgrouping still here, and that's what you're seeing there. So what we thought was, well, that's interesting. Oh, and in fact, you can show it, and here's a different graphical representation. Again, the thickness of the lines representing, you know, who hangs out with whom, and again, the capitals are all the Edinburgh ones. The reason these are so much thicker together is also that these guys not only like hanging out together, they prefer to be in here or inside a lot together, whereas the Edinburgh ones are more, you know, outdoors folk, like to be out there more, and so they're spaced out more, although when you look at who they're closest to, it's still each other. So what we thought, well, you could do that panpipe study, instead of needing two separate groups, what would be interesting would be maybe you could seed those two different techniques, as it were, at each end of this kind of structure. And in fact, what was done, where are we? Pearl, okay. Pearl was one in which one was seeded, and Emma, right down the bottom here, was one of the other group in which the other technique was seeded. So here's, I'm just going to show you a graph now which summarises the result, because what's Pete found, this project hasn't finished yet, right, it's still ongoing, but it did spread, and it did spread separately. Perhaps most impressively, actually, in the Dutch one. So here's Pearl, and the behaviour has spread to each of these, and more recently, actually, so this was Pete's original illustration from his master's thesis this summer, and since then, it's Paul, I think, who's also got this technique, who's using the lift, which was originally seeded in Pearl, whereas Emma was doing the poke behaviour, and that's at least spread to two of them. And it's going to be interesting to see if that will spread more. I expect it ought to, because you remember from the Yerkes results, poke seems to actually come more naturally and easily. So it's interesting that the more unlikely behaviour is already spread without any overlap. And there are other chimpanzees who have at least attempted this. If you look carefully at what they're trying to do, you can tell that they're trying to do a lift but not quite got it yet, or trying to do a poke and not got that. And then you get an even stronger significant result. So it looks as if there's more to unfold. So there's a local story to that, and it fits in with that overall picture I've given you. Okay, well, so let me, coming to the end now, come back to this more specifically medical-like behaviour, natural medicine behaviour, whole leaf swallowing. I mentioned earlier on what they're doing there is taking very rough leaves, very hairy leaves. They don't look appetising at all. You think, why would you take that in? And they kind of roll it in their mouths in a curious way and don't bite it up, so it goes through more whole than a really well-chewed leaf. So here's wild chimpanzees taking in one of these leaves in a kind of slightly funny way, and here as well, kind of quite a delicate operation. Well, Mike Huffman, who was telling those of you who were here in that first lecture about this, didn't get on to tell you. He'd actually done some kind of experiments which are a bit like the ones that I've been telling you about with our tool use, but actually approaching this topic. And the first study he did was in Japan, and then another one he did a similar kind of thing in Italy, where he worked with captive chimpanzees, and these are very specific leaves in Africa, but here what they were doing was going out and seeing in the hedgerow, oh, there are leaves that really look a bit like that, let's try that, give that to the chimpanzees. And what was surprising was that not many, but just a few of the chimpanzees in each case did take these in. So suggests that, well, those individuals weren't learning it socially, it's somehow latent in them to find these attractive. Maybe they weren't feeling well, we don't really know. They certainly weren't heavily infected with parasites. Then what was interesting was that most of them rejected them. They tried them and rejected them, or they wouldn't have anything to do with them. I mean, I wouldn't. They didn't. But then when they saw the other chimpanzees doing it, more of them started to do it. So then there was some secondary evidence that even this behaviour might be socially learned. And you can imagine why this could be quite important in the wild. Not so maybe much in the case of the leaf eating. Another thing chimpanzees do that I think Mike talked about was they peel off the edges of stems and eat particular plants that have very bitter pith. And those seem to actually have pharmacological properties. In fact, local people eat them as well for, again, sort of gut ailments and so on. But you have to be very careful about those because what the outside can be really very poisonous. So it's really important to get this right, this kind of thing. And it's true of feeding in general. You know, there are thousands of things you could eat in a tropical forest, and some of them are really quite poisonous. And yet chimpanzees in one location where it was recorded eat over 400 different things. So somehow you have to work out which are the 400 good things to eat out of the maybe 4,000 that are in the forest. And here's a particular case to do with these medicinal things. Okay, so some evidence of social learning, but then the curious thing they spotted was that when they did a follow-up study more recently in Italy, there were two communities of chimpanzees. And here's a graph showing these. There was little groups, one on an island and another for some reason they called the tree group. And what they noticed, what the difference between the black and white bars are, because you can see whatever the white is something these guys mostly doing, where these have a different habit. There's a very subtle difference, which is shown down here at the bottom, that the black one is what they call complete leaf swallowing. They're taking in leaves a bit more like this, the whole thing, and that's what they're ingesting. The other guys are doing a rather curious thing of partial leaf swallowing, where they're tearing off little bits, and then still quite large chunks, and then those go through whole. But it's a different technique. It's very subtle, but the fact that they're finding this difference seems to imply that something is being socially transmitted between these chimpanzees, and somehow most of them are noticing this very subtle difference in the way their neighbours are doing it, and doing it in the same way. So that's not as strong as an experiment, but it kind of fits in with the picture I've been presenting to you. So, okay, I think it's time to summarise what I've been trying to say, and then see if you have any questions. The broad story I've been telling you here is about cultural transmission, which is the main thing that I study, and our interpretation of what we see in the wild leading us to recognise transmission of culture in chimpanzees. Other studies that have been done in other great apes, particularly orangutans, leads to the same kind of conclusion, that probably the common ancestor of the great apes, therefore, is likely to have had really quite complicated cultural capacities, shown something like these patterns, maybe not quite as complicated as this. And also the contents of those share certain things with us, particularly the whole range of tool use they do, and you saw that, you know, the digging behaviour was just one of them, but there are dozens of different tool use behaviours you see, which seem to be part of a material culture in chimpanzees. And I think the experimental work that we've done producing this kind of picture really enforces the notion that, you know, chimpanzees have these kind of capacities. Okay. Okay, so then in terms of what I was trying to say about health and nutrition, well, we've got cases like a BOSU, where this material culture is what allows animals to stay fit and healthy and well fed, even through bottlenecks which would otherwise mean they probably couldn't sustain life there. Not only nut cracking, but the pestle pounding. Then we've got the case of the young chimpanzees, who as adults, in the case of females, let's say, really need to be good technologists, be able to use these tools to harvest these insect foods to compensate for the fact that they're not getting the larger vertebrate protein. And you know, that really seeming to predict how they're going to behave a year or two later. And then finally, the story I just told you, which suggests that, again, there may be cultural elements in here, even though for some chimpanzees there's some kind of latent desire to do this, because some individuals just start doing it anyway. And yet, you know, you do have this kind of interesting story.